research. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to House Orders on June 23rd, 2022. Members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. We have a busy committee tonight, or today. We have, first off, is the witnesses for the support for commercialization of intellectual properties, and then we have the last hour in camera business to discuss. So I would like to make a few comments for the benefits of witnesses and members. Interpretation for Zoom, you can have the choice at the bottom of your screen of either floor, English, or French. For those in the room, you can use the earpiece and select the desired channel. Remind that all comments should be addressed through the chair. In accordance with our routine motion, I am informing the committee that all witnesses have completed the required connection tests in advance of the meeting. We will start our witnesses with 5 minutes for each one for an opening statement, then followed by rounds of questions. Today, I'll hand the floor over to Mr. Hinton for 5 minutes, and if you would, please do your best to keep it within 5 minutes. I'll give you a little heads up when you're roughly around the minute mark that's left. So, Mr. Hinton, the floor is yours for 5 minutes.
Great, thank you. And thank you to the committee for inviting me to speak. I'm Jim Hinton, an IP lawyer, patent agent, trademark agent with Own Innovation. I'm a senior fellow at the Center for International Governance Innovation. I'm the co-founder of the Innovation Asset Collective, as well as an assistant professor at Western University. I'll begin my remarks by explaining why Canada has been focusing on the wrong thing when it comes to innovation policy, and then move to concrete suggestions on how Canada can properly position its innovation policy. Our misorientation on innovation policy has created significant risk to Canada's economic prosperity. If we don't reorient, Canada is at risk of becoming a middle-income country. IP and data aren't everything, but they're almost everything. More than 90% of the value of companies today are in intangible assets. Registered IP, like patents and trademarks, are only the tip of the iceberg. While the US, China, Europe, and other savvy countries have shifted decades ago to intangible asset capture, Canada has not prioritized owning and commercializing intellectual property. You can't commercialize what you don't own, and as a country, Canada does not own very much IP. For example, in the clean technology space, we own less than 1% of global IP. No one is expecting us to be China or the US, but we are barely in the game, and things are actually getting worse. We need to get our own piece of the pie. As we've heard from other witnesses, IP provides freedom to operate, which prevents or discourages others from taking your market. However, importantly, others' IP limits your freedom to operate, even though you don't intentionally steal anything. They leverage their IP position to limit your ability to grow and scale, and in many ways, IP is zero-sum. You have the IP and you get paid, you don't, and you end up paying. Currently, we allow our publicly funded IP to be given away. We do the hard work of funding the research, creating the great ideas, but then we assign the rights to that IP to foreign companies, where they make the money on our IP, sell the products back to us, and most devastatingly, they use Canadian-funded IP against us. More than half of all industry-assigned IP that comes out of Canadian universities is assigned to foreign companies. So Canadian universities are actually limiting the freedom to operate of Canadian companies. They're not going to like me saying this, but as it currently stands for research outputs, Canadian universities are part of the problem. In a particularly egregious example for Canada's so-called AI strategy, with hundreds of millions of dollars in public funding, only 7% of the IP generated ended up in Canadian industry hands, with 75% of the IP being generated being owned by foreign companies. That could not have been our intention. Enough about the problems, they're well documented. On to solutions. First, we must understand what success in the innovation economy means. Success is having Canadian-owned IP commercialized globally and at scale. We need a whole-of-government approach to embed Canadian-owned IP and data assets in global value chains. We need to decrease our IP deficit and move from being IP renters to being IP owners. So how do we do that? We need to instill the mechanisms and infrastructure to support economic prosperity and increased productivity. 1, full stack and coordinated IP education, so companies know the rules of the game. We have existing programs like the Innovation Asset Collective, CIPO Outreach, IP Law Clinics, IRAP IP Assist, and new programs like Elevate IP and IP Ontario, as well as other provincial efforts. These programs need to be turbocharged. Number 2, IP generation, to ensure that companies capture what they create, providing resources to support Canadian companies to action IP strategies, and ensure that all innovation programs make IP costs eligible. Number 3, IP retention, because the wealth accrues to the IP owner. We need to ensure that Canadian companies are the ones commercializing and making money from the IP. Mandate universities and research institutions to prioritize Canadian companies and steward publicly funded IP for Canadian economic benefit. In the review of SHRED, we must ensure that IP being funded is beneficially owned by Canadian companies. 4, collective action. But even if we do IP education, IP generation, IP retention, that will not be enough because the world of IP is already owned. We need to catch up. So take collective effort to increase freedom to operate with patent collectives, data collectives, and across all strategically important sectors, as every sector is now an IP sector. Fundamentally, we need to take a whole-of-government approach to increase freedom to operate for Canadian companies. If we get this right, it will mean economic prosperity for generations. If we get it wrong, it means that we won't be able to pay for the social programs that Canadians rely on. I'm happy to discuss.
Thank you so much for that testimony. We'll have the second 5-minute opening statement, and then we'll go into rounds of questioning. Ms. Gunya, the floor is yours for 5 minutes.
Oui, bonjour.
Good morning. I'm Marie Gagné, Chief Executive Officer of Synchronex. And what is a CCTT? It is a transfer of technology entity and for research, basic research and applied research. So we have 59 in Quebec, CCTTs, and each one is, specializes in an expertise promoting technological and social innovation. And that includes agriculture, people who are disabled, and these experts are around the whole province of Quebec. So these are in polytechnical institutions elsewhere in Canada as well. So we're hoping to work with some 6,000 other entities and organizations and the realization of 11,000 projects. So we want to commercialize and this is innovating to integrate it into a market. So to commercialize it is to use it. The committee could be called the support for the use of intellectual property. When we think that more than 50% of Canada's GDP is connected to small and medium-sized businesses, we have to think about what their needs are. Our SMEs need a model that is simple and that allows us to overcome their resistance to innovate, a method that's rapid, and we can quickly see what the benefits of innovation are. And a system that is not too onerous, that allows companies to protect their profits, which they suffered so much from from a loss of during the pandemic. So with patents, it's not a simple process. And what we are saying is that intellectual property has to be worked and assigned, which we do in 59% of the cases that we are working with in businesses. We assign the application to them for their particular sphere of activity. So we develop, say, a new thing for dentists, and we can continue to work on this for batteries, this metallurgical product, and in space applications as well. So this is all intellectual property things. We are involved in incremental innovation, and we work in cooperation with the universities, and often it's a more formal IP, and there's a trademark involved, which is to work through the university's board in cooperation with an agency in Quebec. that deals with intellectual property. So, as recommendations for the committee, it's really in terms of funding, it's quite simple. If we want our businesses to be able to use intellectual property, to market it, to commercialize it, we have to support the funding of applied research better. So for the polytechnical institutions, they're experts in innovation, and we have to allow this use of IP. We found in the most recent budget more than $100 million for colleges and NSERC's community. These funds are in place for 3 years. So 3 years doesn't allow for the development of a long-term strategy. 3 years does not allow to hire the best talent and to keep those people in those positions. We need recurring, ongoing funding. And the $70 million that was asked for was a minimum. We have to support our SMEs in innovation so that intellectual property will be used. And we also have to support better the connections between applied and basic research in the universities. We have to shorten the time between the idea, the invention, and the innovation, and the moment where it is commercialized and put on the market. And in order to do that, we have to better support the relationships and project development between applied research and the universities before the businesses become involved, in order to reduce the risks involved, and also so that what's being offered to them would be easy to integrate and easy to create wealth for Canada. I'm prepared to answer your questions.
Thank you so much for that. We will now enter the first round of questions, which will be 6 minutes apiece for each MP. And kicking it off, we have MP Mazer for 6 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Hinton, for being here today. The Globe and Mail reported that Canada's spy agency specifically warned Canadian universities about research ties with Huawei. Are you aware of this advice from CSIS?
Yes, CSIS is actively monitoring Canadian research institutions for IP transfer, reviewing ties to foreign government actors, and then we've seen with the banning of 5G organizations like Huawei in particular.
Okay, thank you. Despite this warning, the University of British Columbia admitted at this committee that they are still working with Huawei technologies. We also know that multiple Canadian universities have transferred intellectual property to Huawei. Do you have any idea how many universities have ongoing research partnerships with Huawei despite the warnings from CSIS?
Yeah, there's at least 20 Canadian universities that have been working with Huawei. And more recently, I pulled up some recent patent data, University of Toronto, McGill, Ottawa, Laval, Waterloo, UBC, Carleton, École Polytechnique, Western, Regina, McMaster, all of these universities continue to work with Huawei. Nobody's told them to stop. They're getting money. They're happy. So they'll continue on.
Wow. Canadian universities receive government funding for research. This means that intellectual property transferred to Huawei by Canadian universities could be funded by these research funds. Would you agree?
Yeah, Canadian universities are getting money. I think they got $3.34 billion in federal funding, and Huawei would be one of the beneficiaries of this funding. Huawei's been able to generate hundreds of patents out of Canadian universities over the years.
Well, okay, thank you. Has the current government done anything to guarantee that government research funding is not being used to develop intellectual property for Huawei or for the other entities that CSIS warned against?
No, it's actually the opposite. There are incentive programs through NSERC to encourage Canadian universities to partner with organizations like Huawei. There's nothing stopping a researcher or a university from continuing to work with those organizations, and as we've seen, they'll continue to do that unless somebody steps up and says, maybe we need to reconsider this. We did see out of Alberta, the Alberta government said enough is enough, and those universities were told to stop. But it's clear that the universities aren't governing them themselves well enough. Somebody needs to come in and say it's time to handle this more appropriately.
So so the Alberta government's done it. Is there any other governments that you're
No.
aware of that have said?
Yeah, and so last year we saw, or early this year we saw that Canadian researchers were working with Chinese military scientists, and then very quickly that was pushed back on. But corporate actors like Huawei continue to be available for partnership, and a lot of these universities are in long-term agreements with these and getting a few $1 million here and there to send the IP and all the commercial value back to Huawei.
CNN Business reported that Huawei backtracked on a patent application they filed for a facial recognition system intended to identify Uyghurs from other ethnic groups. As you know, Parliament declared Beijing's treatment of the Uyghurs as a genocide. How do we know that technologies being developed with Huawei in Canadian universities are not being used by the Chinese Communist Party for uses such as surveillance of minority populations?
Yeah, we don't know. Like if you look at the list of IP that's coming out of Canadian universities that's being assigned to organizations like Huawei, it's artificial intelligence, it's photonics, it's advanced processing, and so really somebody needs to understand this, and we need to get to the bottom of it. There's a transparency issue here. We don't know who and what is being done with Canadian publicly funded research. And there's egregious examples that we need to make sure are not happening. There's policies in place, but the fox is in charge of the hen house. The researcher who wants to get the money is the one checking the box to say, yeah, there's no issue here. And they're not security experts either, and so they're not trained on what the geopolitical issues they need to be looking for, and they don't have that expertise. And so we need somebody to do that, and that's proper governance.
Okay. I guess I got about a minute left. Is there anything else you wanted to add from your opening statements or any of the questions I've asked?
Yeah. I think that Huawei's one example, and it's an egregious example because of we're working with them through the front door when we're worried about them going through our secure data networks. But it happens across the board, and we basically give away our IP to global companies all the time. We're just happy to participate, and that 75% of the AI IP is just abysmal. Nobody should be thinking that we need to be funding and giving away our IP like that. And they're profiting off of us. They're using that data. There's no control over it. It's not how innovation works.
Yeah, 21 extra seconds there. Thank you for being very tight with your time. Now moving on to Madame Diab for 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and bienvenue à nos...
Welcome to our witnesses today. Ms. Gagné, I have a few questions for you. First of all, I want to say congratulations for all of your experience in this domain. I'm very interested to know how many women, in your opinion, what do you think are the problems in particular for women in this domain to commercialize intellectual property? Can you talk to us a little bit about that this morning? Are there particular obstacles for women in this domain? I would say that it's the fight that women have in general to position themselves and get their share of these activities in society. But are the issues related to intellectual property more significant? I'd say that in innovation, particularly when it's social innovation, that's what I'd like to talk about. In social innovation, the commercialization of new ways of doing things, of new approaches, and everything that involves equity, inclusion, decolonization, all of that is part of this. And we forget very often when we're talking about commercialization of IP that this is the case. That's why I prefer to talk about the use of IP. and intellectual property that's developed in social integration, it results in multiple wealth. We can transfer it into to several organizations, and often the knowledge we want it to go out and multiply and be shared very broadly. So I think that if we want to help women's position and the position of minorities, we can't forget the mechanisms that have to be put in place to support the use of intellectual property in social innovation. And for that to happen, one way of doing so would be indeed to have funds, research funds for applied research, on the same model as the communities of NSERC, that same kind of structure, but have that adapted to the reality of college applied research and the CIHR, as well as at NSERC, as I say. It would be the beginning of that kind of appropriation, new practices in society that are innovative and that are broad. So you touched on a very important subject. In your opinion, in Quebec, and as well as in the rest of Canada, what are the support measures that are currently in place? And are there any suggestions that you could make to us here at this committee for the government and for the research that we could improve? Yes, we often talk about the economic value, which is connected to IP, but I think we should talk about the socio-economic value that's related to intellectual property. In Quebec and in Canada, we have scientists and researchers who are at a very high level in the colleges and polytechnical institutes, as well as in the universities. So I think we have to make a bridge between more basic research and applied research, and we have to really set up additional funds that will be there to support the transfer of knowledge to the other businesses, and businesses that have not got a lot of money, but they have the ability to reach a broad swath of the population. And often the most vulnerable people that are left aside, but also professionals, where there is a lot of societal improvement that can and should be done in terms of health in particular. You know, we don't manage health, we manage illness. So if we want to manage health, we have to talk about social innovation before the technology is in place. Okay, thank you.
About three things in terms of IP. I got education, generation, retention. I want to ask you specifically on education. And you spoke about a lot of programs. Can you tell me from the ones you've identified and you've used or some of your clients have used, what in particular is out there for female or people from, indigenous communities or marginalized communities that is out there that that we can use, or what can you recommend based on what you are aware of?
Yeah. So the Innovation Asset Collective, an organization I co-founded, and $30 million federally funded program. It's a pilot. Has a fantastic report on women in underrepresented groups. We worked on that for quite some time, and so my colleague there, Myra Tofik, out of the University of Windsor, and the team prepared a fantastic sort of report as well as action items. And so there's a specific funding program for women and other underrepresented groups within the Innovation Asset Collective. But that is limited and very limited and time limited now, and it will be done within by the end of March unless there is renewed funding. And so that will stop. And so there needs to be full funding for that, and taking the recommendations. And there's a number of recommendations that Myra and the team at IAC made to expand resourcing for women and other underrepresented groups.
Thank you. That's my time. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that round. Now moving on to MP Blanchette Jones for the block.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank the witnesses for this important study today. My first question will be for Ms. Gagné from Saint-Chroniques. I say hello. It's always nice to see you again. Ms. Gagné, you referred to the recent budget in your opening statement, including the investment of the government over 3 years in the colleges and communities. So I analyzed the budget myself as well, as you know, but I didn't see the $0 that is yet something that the scientific community has agreed on. All the witnesses we heard from for the last year and a half since this committee has existed, and despite that, the government didn't pay attention and even asked for a new report to find out what's happening in the scientific community, and they completely ignored the recommendations in the report. And obviously, Ms. Gagné, I'm talking about the Bouchard report that was published last March. So I'd like to hear you more specifically on the fact of this lack of investment to finance research, because that's what really constitutes the first step in innovation. In the meantime, our competitors, the Americans, under the CHIPS and Science Act, doubled their funding for basic research, the National Science Foundation, which is the most significant program for the next few years. So I'd like to know, Ms. Gagné, Canada continues to not grow in this area. So do you support what I'm saying? And I'd like to know what the risks are that will affect your activities in this, given this situation. Thank you. Well, development of knowledge is the basis of the creation of wealth. We know that our businesses and organizations have to position themselves on the local, national, and international stages. And this includes what they do in terms of municipal governance. And innovation today is something unavoidable. If we want to really have knowledge that will be there for new research that we'll be able to implement, I'm sure that I agree with Maxime. We really have to better support the research, and the research in the broad sense. So yes, basic research, but when we look at the TRLs, we have to be able to support every link in the chain along the way, because the weakest link in the chain is where it breaks. If we want to be able to have innovation and knowledge, and that knowledge will get all the way through to the PMEs, or the SMEs rather, and then we have to really fund properly everything along the whole way, from the basic research to the applied research, so that the knowledge developed in the universities gets all the way through the chain to our organizations and businesses, because the wealth is created there. The wealth is created when the invention becomes innovation, when the knowledge becomes something that's used. So yes, we have to fund better and more all of the TRLRs in research. Thank you, Ms. Gagné. I'll continue with the issue of the budget. We had Mr. Jeffrey Taylor, President of the National Advisory Committee on Colleges and Institutes in Canada, who testified recently before the committee, and he shared with us that Canadian colleges received only 2.39% of research funds from the funding councils in 2020. So I'd like to know what your opinion is of that. And I'd like to come back to what you talked about in terms of funding, which is short-term, over 3 years. What are the impacts and consequences for your organization because of that? Well, we have to salute the extra funding that was given to the innovation programs and at the end, the NSERC community and the colleges. But as I said, it's one-time funding. So the issue with one-time funding is that it doesn't allow you to develop long-term strategies. It doesn't allow you to buy, to set up new equipment. It doesn't allow to attract, and keep the best talents. And when we offer short-term contracts, we're not competitive on the market. So that has a significant impact for Canada and the fact that we much better support basic research, but very little in applied research. And it's in applied research that wealth and value is created. So we really have to rebalance the investments in research so that the basic research is better supported, but it has to be supported along the whole length of the chain. So with each link, when we move from one to the next, from one level to the next, that we are able to properly and adequately fund this work. So we ensure that it isn't integrated just by the businesses. And that we have to make sure it's long term. Thank you very much, Ms. Gagné. I'm sorry. No, that's okay. We'll come back to IP, Ms. Gagné. From your perspective, how can we support this development for this continuum of research, and how can we ensure that we have closer cooperation between people doing fundamental research in the universities and people doing the applied research rather in the CCTTs, so that these things do become innovations?
This round of questions, but I would ask the witness to please submit a written response to the last question. Moving on to our guest MP for the day. Welcome MP Angus to our committee for 6 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. It's an honor to be at this committee. Mr. Hinton, I want to start with you. I was interested in you talk about how IP is leveraged against companies. It's against our potential of innovation. And we certainly know, like with Google, Amazon, Meta, Apple, the whole concept of this kill zone of innovation, that they have this their data banks are so without parallel ability to, their predictive abilities to anticipate, their massive legal war chest, and their control of market. How do we, as Canadians, even play in that game when we see the kill zone of innovation around so much of startups?
Yeah, and so those big companies, they've amassed tens of thousands of patents. Their data sets are unparalleled globally, and we continue to feed those as users, right? And they always say in the last year, they've generated more data than they have in all the years before that, and so it's always continuing to ramp up. And so what we need to do is reduce this asymmetry. There's a significant freedom to operate limitation when you're getting into markets where these big players are, and so you need to reduce the IP and data asymmetry. You need to build an IP position that you can leverage against them. It's not about getting patents for protecting your inventions. It's as much as it's about getting patents that are going to read on what they're doing to neutralize the threat of what they have. And so these big players need to be neutralized, and you can't do these. If you do it one-off with one company at a time, they're going to keep buying you up or knocking you out and restricting your ability to grow and scale.
Well, one of the arguments that have been used is on antitrust, but I mean, antitrust tends on competitive pricing, whereas this is a whole different thing. This is about limiting future potential and future possibilities by just buying up or sidelining innovation, giving their massive power in market share and data power. You mentioned the issue of, or the idea of IP collectives. Is that what we have to look at as Canada? Like, how do we as a nation, I mean, I'd love us to take on antitrust, but I don't think our American neighbors are going to like that very much. Antitrust is going to have to come out of the United States, really, to make this happen, or Europe, but I don't know if we could do that. Would the data collectives be a way, or IP collectives be a way of trying to level the playing field somewhat?
Yeah. Maybe first to competition policy, antitrust. It is absolutely a strategic lever to embed Canadian companies in global value chains. That's what the Americans use their antitrust policy to do. They grow their companies using competition policy or not using it to ensure that their companies are inserted into global value chains. So that is absolutely a lever that we can use to increase the freedom to operate for Canadian companies if done strategically. But as you mentioned, IP collectives, the Innovation Asset Collective, which I co-founded, Mike McLean was here earlier at the committee and spoke on that. That needs to be funded and expanded. Right now, it's just for data-driven clean tech companies. It needs to be much broader than that. And really on the data side, and we saw that this was Sidewalk Labs. If you read the book that's out on that, I'll get a brief mention because I helped work with the Waterfront Toronto team on that and reorient the policy. But it's about reducing the asymmetry in data and allowing Canadian companies to be able to access Canadian generated data to be able to use that as a commercial asset. And so there's the privacy concerns that need to be navigated and managed, but ultimately, if the data is an asset and these big companies are able to use that and far out commercialize you because they have access to that information, we need to be able to get to that scale, and we can really only mimic that scale because we're a small open economy in a collective way. And so pooling data assets that Canadian companies can access and commercialize.
I'm really interested you raised the issue of Sidewalk Labs because I was certainly pushed for the investigation at the federal level into why we were. It seemed would it seem that we are naive in dealing with these companies? I mean, we were turning over a massive piece of prime real estate to one of the biggest companies in the world to do whatever they wanted, and we were told it'll be really cool for Toronto to give over all of this land, all of this potential, and hey, they'll get all our data, but they'll put it in some kind of trust, maybe at a library someplace. I mean, the whole thing from start to finish raised serious questions about public interest, public space, the public right to know, and yet all those seem to just go by the wayside because it was Google and Apple, or it was Google, and they were supposed to be cool. Is there a naivety to Canada's approach to this?
Yeah, absolutely. We got the bum's rush on the whole thing, and we were hoodwinked into doing that deal. And luckily, we got out of it because it would have just been generations of economic opportunity lost. It was a land grab, but a data grab, which is really even worse. And some of the predatory contracting, all sorts of things that were embedded in there. And I, on the record, saying that the patent terms were laughably stupid. They were trying to make the Canadians agree to things that were just foolish. They said, we're not going to sue you in Canada, but if you enter the U.S. market, we'll use our patents to sue you. So it wasn't a partnership. It was them coming in, and it was at all three levels of government that we saw it: Toronto, Ontario, as well as the federal government. And everybody sort of saw the Google, and maybe at the time the Google brand was stronger than it is now, and what's happening with some of the other data aspects. But it was a failure of political leadership across the board.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for that round of questioning. Now moving on to our 5-minute round, we have Mr. Soroka from the Conservatives. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And starting off with Mr. Hinton, would you say that basically we do a poor job of trying to patent anything in Canada? It seems like we do job creation at our universities to do research, and that's about it. And then we just sort of let the money flow out. And was that a good assessment? Yeah.
It's really on two fronts. If you look at our research institutions, it's philanthropy. We're giving this stuff away. And so we do universities are great. We do two things well: education and basic research. But that's being given away. And then when it comes to applied research and commercialization, it doesn't happen. There was $4.5 billion spent on research and development at universities in 2018. Guess how much they made in commercialization? $54.4 million. So anybody can turn $4.5 billion into $54 million. It's easy. You can make more money. Just don't spend as much money as you spent before. So it's not happening. Universities are not doing commercialization. It's either basic research or philanthropy. And so we need to get more of the reorientation around supporting Canadian companies and having Canadian headquartered companies commercialize and scale globally. And then if you look at some of the funding initiatives, even recently, as recent as yesterday with Ericsson, Canadian public funding there, Nokia, these are global companies, and we're giving them money to generate IP, and then we're going to buy that back from us. Maybe it's a little bit better than Huawei, but it's still no good. This is not what innovative economies need to be doing. We need to be the ones setting up Canadian branch plants in Finland, in Sweden, or wherever else there's great talent, and harvesting data and IP from them, and then commercializing that globally. We're doing it backwards.
Okay, because we've been working with these big tech companies for so long and they patent so much, is there really any patents left that isn't going to infringe on them to some degree, or are we now forced to work with them because we have no patents of our own?
Yeah, so I work with Canadian companies, and in the software space especially, you will be infringing somebody else's patent because there's so many patents out there. Up until last year, IBM was filing 9,000 patents, more than all of Canadians combined. So there's this upward trajectory, and now with the Chinese filing millions of patents annually as well, there's no bottom to intellectual property generation. You just keep filing more patents. And so Canadian companies aren't capturing at the same scale. They're not meeting the same pace. The IP deficit is growing, getting worse. And then when you factor intangible assets like data, it starts to dramatically increase because of the value and opacity of how data can be commercialized and used.
So obviously this government realizes this, and that's why they're starting to change so many things. And I had one of our colleagues brought up about women and Indigenous and underrepresented having funding available. Part of that funding, is there anything in there where they have to patent it, where they can have long-term stability, or is that just a quick job creation and make it look like they're doing something?
So on the IP initiatives, yes,
Yeah.
but they're significantly subscale. You can't give $40 million to Nokia and then at the same breath give $10,000 through NRC IRAP IP Assist to a Canadian company. You're increasing the asymmetry rather than trying to catch up. You're putting wind in the sails of the foreign companies, and then you're putting anchors on the Canadian companies.
Yeah, so there's a lot of restrictions and a lot of problems that this government is doing, or their lack of it. What other areas do you think they need to improve upon?
When you look at the Strategic Innovation Fund, if a Canadian company wants to get this, there's IP retention terms in here. If you leave, you have to either pay it back or leave the IP behind. That doesn't happen with Nokia. Finland gets the IP immediately. The patents have Nokia Finland's address on it, and so we give Canadian companies a worse deal than we give these big established players, and those are the ones that we want to insert into that value chain and capture some of that value, and we're doing the opposite.
So would you say these foreign companies are well aware of how easy it is to get, I guess, research done at our expense, knowing that they're going to profit highly from it, so they're intentionally coming here to work with us?
Yeah, there's a reason Ohio doesn't want Southwestern Ontario's Volkswagen battery manufacturing facility. It's because it's not economic. There's no spillovers that's happening. If there were 100 jobs in a factory 10 years ago, there's 10 now, and 8 of those jobs are coming from Volkswagen Germany. And so there's 2 people pushing around brooms in a factory. I used to work in Southwestern Ontario for a heavy truck manufacturer. These are parking lots. The Mexicans took the jobs. Canadians don't want these jobs. Nobody wants these jobs, but we're funding companies to create the atmosphere of jobs. The Michelin plant, we give $30 million. Michelin has 10,000 patents. It's an IP game. It's not about jobs.
Okay, so it's just more looking like we're doing something than actually doing anything. Can you give us other opportunities where this government should change their direction and how they could do that to make sure that the patents stay with us?
It's simple. It's about prioritizing Canadian companies and doing whatever you can through tax policy, innovation policy, competition policy to increase Canadian companies' freedom to operate globally. And so putting the wind in the sails of the Canadian company, using domestic market, strategic procurement as another example. There's a lot of levers, and the Americans do it, certainly the Chinese, the Koreans, you see the Scandinavians are doing it, and other European countries. We're not doing it. We're just being taken advantage of.
Yeah, it sounds very... Okay, that's it for me then.
Thank you so much for that. Moving on to MP Lauzon for 5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. My first question will be for Ms. Gagné, if you will. There are concerns that we've heard today concerning national security and patents that are transferred to other foreign countries, and indeed, the Minister of Innovation, Science and Economic Development has set up a certain number of obstacles because we want to concern ourselves with national security. But we understood that it involved direct communication and cooperation with universities so that they are aware of the risk of this transfer of intellectual property. Also, we created new guidelines on national security and of the funding to support post-secondary institutions so that they can better identify and deal with risks. So with the legislation in Canada on foreign investments, these are scrutinized by the government, including all sensitive sectors that are the subject of in-depth reviews, including universities. So the government passed C-34, and I don't know if you are aware of this, but Madame Gagné, could you comment to us on the importance of this kind of review to protect Canadian intellectual property? Have sat on several committees and worked in cooperation with universities. I'd like to give some nuance to Mr. Hinton's comments. More and more universities are aware of the importance of setting up mechanisms in order to analyze the risks related to partnerships with foreign entities, particularly connected to security. So I think that things are moving forward at a good speed, even within the funding institutions. In Quebec, we have industrial research support, and even within that network, we're setting up practices to limit the risks when we make investments in innovation. So obviously things won't change from one day to the next, but I would say over the last 2 years, the change has been radical. How we assess the risk tied to partnerships and industrial partnerships. The mechanisms are more and more tight, and they're complex. So what Mr. Hinton has raised is that indeed often we have the name of the first business, but we need to look at who's behind it all. So indeed, to have people who study the issue and have a centralized office allows us to identify those potential partners and what their risk might be. That would be an added value for sure. Close to my riding, I have research centers that are education-based. So I have the Cégep of Saint-Jérôme, and they innovated. There's a lot of development on plastic derivatives, and they're working in full cooperation with the universities and with private industry. So private businesses have a role that is incredibly important. They're the ones that create the demand. And yesterday, I was at Lyon, which is the first Quebec-based battery producer, and 1,000 feet away from the factory there is a business that is also working with universities. So in your opinion, Mr. Hinton, is that a good model for funding those industries who are working in cooperation with the universities and in cooperation with the private sector to ensure that we have intellectual property that will stay here in Canada?
As you mentioned, the strategic alignment, to make sure that we have Canadian universities that are generating the IP, and then Canadian companies that are around it to be able to be the receptors. And then from a value chain perspective, from critical mineral, batteries, electric vehicles, and even self-driving vehicles, there's Canadian companies across the value chain that own intellectual property and that are inserted into the global value chain and are commercializing. So we need to make sure that that Canadian company that is receiving that IP gets wind in their sails and is going to be able to commercialize and expand their market opportunity.
Thank you. Do we more time left?
4 seconds.
Okay, let's have another question. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you so much. With that, we are now on to the 2.5-minute round. We have MP Blanchette for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question's for Ms. Gagné. Quick question, quick answer. How can we better support the technology of startups? Yes. Obviously, I'm going to defend my people. The Centers for Applied Research are good vectors to help to quickly finalize what we want. The minimum viable product, the MVP, will help those startups to develop in an accelerated process for the first product that you want to commercialize. So to facilitate the work between the applied research and the startups is extremely important. We want to get a first product on the market quickly, but after that we know that we'll have to optimize that to quickly have a second that is of a better quality. So that kind of closeness is extremely important. The research teams and startups are very limited. They have little funds to have access to equipment. So having the most recent technology at their fingertips is so important. Thank you, Ms. Gagne. And I say hello to Mr. Hinton. Very important what you've said. So there's a lot of technology that has been developed here that's in foreign hands, and it's worrisome, I agree. So other witnesses came before us and said that Canada, it has to decide, do we want to be a consumer, a net consumer, or do we want to be an exporter of solutions developed here in Canada? So I'd like to tell us concretely what the risks and consequences are if we don't do anything, if there's no strategy, what risks happening for Canadian businesses, and what are the forecasts for Canada's
sort of the makeup of the Canadian economy. If we don't have our global champions, then our prosperity is going to continue to erode. We're always going to continue to pay more and more for the world's IP. And so even from a tax perspective, we're going to have less and less of a tax base, companies offshoring their IP, and so we won't be able to pay for social programs that we need and want, and it will continue to erode. So we need to turn into Canadian companies that are commercializing globally, bringing wealth back into the country instead of really doing the opposite. It's existential. This is generational wealth transfer that we're losing now, and it takes decades to catch up. It takes 20 years for the patent to run its course, and so we have to put in pieces in place, as the Chinese did 15 years ago, about generating, capturing, and then expanding their IP strategies.
Merci.
Thank you.
To our last round of questions, or last MP questioning, we have MP Angus for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. We've seen with Joe Biden's IRA, one of the things that, from I talk to people in industry, that they find so invigorated by is it seems to be this whole government approach, a whole larger economic strategy, not just sprinkling tax credits, but I mean they are in a global intellectual IP global war with China as to who's going to be the innovator, who's going to control that market. And so they brought all these facets in order to make sure that green technologies are going to advance America's economic, social, climate targets. Now, we've just seen in the recent budget, the Trudeau government, we got $85 billion in green investments, which is great. We've managed to secure a number of commitments on making sure jobs, apprenticeships. But do you see if Canada is actually tying these investments to a larger IP strategy so that we actually benefit and we're not just, the traditional hewers of wood and drawers of water?
Yeah, so no. The recent budget and budgets before it, just on the upstream side, if you fund, say, okay, everybody buy an electric vehicle, that doesn't ensure that there's any economic value happening here. We saw with wind turbines in Ontario, it's a massive wealth transfer to whoever owns the IP on those wind turbines, Samsung, Siemens, Korean companies. And so it doesn't necessarily mean that there's going to be any economic benefit. And a lot of that demand side means that we're going to be ending up buying American company cars, electric vehicles, and nothing left here. We're going to be doing the hard work of physically assembling the pieces that the robots won't do, but everything else we're paying for. And so it's backwards. It's missing the IP capture part. Insertion of Canadian companies into the electric vehicle value chain. Do that. Stop. And the Americans are doing it. The U.S. Department of Energy has been doing it 15 years ago and systematically. Anytime a Canadian company files a patent for a battery, they're getting called up by Chinese investors saying, look, we want to invest in your company because the Chinese want to own that piece of the value chain. Yeah. We're not doing that.
So we can do that without being on the wrong side of our global trade agreement.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. These are all standards and approaches that and playbooks that other countries have taken. We modeled the Innovation Asset Collective off of the French, the Korean, the Japanese approach to being higher performing on intellectual property. So there's nothing offside of trade agreements to ensure that Canadians are participating in the global economy.
Okay, thank you.
And we're ahead of schedule a little bit, so we're going to squeak in 2 rounds of 4-minute questioning. Now we have MP Lubb for 4 minutes.
Thanks, Mr. Hinton. One question I wanted to ask you about is the net benefit test. And the net benefit test, I think, for 2023 indexed is just under $2 billion. But most of the small tech startup companies don't IPO it at $2 billion in Canada, and they have an enterprise market value of many multiples less than $2 billion. Do you think that Canada needs to take another look at the net benefit test and say, okay, we are investing so much here at the university level and through SRED and IRAP, only to see when it's just about to blossom, you know, a U.S. private equity firm comes in and takes it out and consolidates the market that it's created. So do we need to look at the net benefit test?
Yeah, countries are going further and further upstream to acquire companies that are going to fill those links in their value chain. And so you need to take, if we say we want to be good at electric vehicles or critical minerals or you name the sector, there needs to be a coordinated effort to make sure that we retain those companies. And companies are going to come and go, they get bought and sold, but we want to retain as many of them as possible. And if they go under because they're bad companies, make sure that that happens as well. But we need to be able to sort of keep filling the pipeline and then accelerating those companies to scale. It's all about scale, and you can't scale if the foundation that you're built upon is already owned. And that's what happens when you own 1% of the clean tech IP, for example. And we generally speaking, own 1% of global IP across all sectors.
Yeah, and I don't want to be a conspiracy theorist, but I noticed like when Magnet Forensics sold in Kitchener-Waterloo, it was just under the threshold that would have required a net benefit test. And I'm not saying the industry minister would have decided against that sale, but I thought it was a little interesting that it did come in under that amount. The other thing I want to ask you about is BlackBerry recently sold 32,000 of their older patents that they say are non-core to a U.S., I think it was private equity company, whatever it was. But I mean, there had to have been tens of millions of dollars of Canadian taxpayers' dollars invested in SRED and IRAP and all these things to come up with some of these patents. Not all, but some. Do you think the Canadian government, the taxpayer, has any right at all to any of those dollars when they're sold? Or is that just part of government business?
It's too late. It's way too late to be looking at it now.
Yeah.
So when we fund this Nokia deal for $40 million of public funding, where are the terms in there? So start today, but not after the tree's already been cut down and it's gone. From my understanding, a lot of the IP and the value in the BlackBerry portfolio has been extracted. They've licensed it out, and now it's just about converting the stack of patents in the corner of the office into a pile of money. And so the commercialization.
Last quick question before my time runs out. We had the Canadian IP office appear a month ago, and they said everything's great, they're faster than ever, they're more robust than ever, and I know you don't want to get on the wrong side of your applications. Is that the sense, without shooting yourself in the foot? Is that the sense they're doing better, or is there more work to be done yet?
Yeah, they were set up to fail to a certain extent. It's 3 years to get a trademark examined, and a trademark is a 1 or 2 page document, relatively simple thing. So there's a significant backlog, and so they need support from an administrative perspective, processing these documents, and then from a strategic perspective, how do we use the Canadian Intellectual Property Office to empower Canadians to better file both domestically, but predominantly where their global markets are.
Okay.
Thank you so much for that. Now on to Madame Bradford for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you, Madame Gagné, for appearing again before our committee. And Mr. Hinton, welcome to Ottawa. I believe the last time we met was in December when we made the announcement about the Elevate IP. The $90 million investment that the federal government has made into accelerators and incubators like Communitech, which got $38 million of that. And so that is going to help companies in Ontario, Manitoba, and Saskatchewan. And you, of course, were at that announcement. And at the time, here's a quote that you gave us at that time: without protection, IP is going to flow out of the country, then the value from that IP being commercialized is lost forever, and then we're going to have to pay to use that technology, even though we built it. Similar to what you said this morning in your opening. So as the founder of Own Innovation, you'll be directly involved in advising startups through the Elevate IP program. Can you tell us how you and your company are benefiting from that and how this Elevate IP program is going to help address some of these problems that you've been identifying in your testimony this morning?
Yeah. So Elevate IP, relatively brand new program, and so there's, I think, a number of different aspects. I've been working and consulting with Communitech to help frame this and supporting them on how to best frame it for Canadian companies. And so education, I think, is a key piece, making sure companies know the rules of the game, but also at a sector-specific level. So within different sectors on how to manage intellectual property there. I think that's table stakes. We need to be doing that. People need to know how to manage IP. And then the next piece, to me, I'm hopeful, optimistic that a lot of the funding will flow into the companies to be able to generate IP and retain IP, and so get the patents that they need or get any other intellectual property protection that they need.
Right, and it seems that it's going to help address that the issue of 90% of the value are in intangible assets like IP. So can you tell me how you're utilizing this through your company, Own Innovation, in the companies you're working with, so that they can leverage this program?
Right. And so from the education side, but then also from the resourcing perspective, so they can get the patent that they need. These early stage companies, talk about the valley of death, or they're going from an idea to commercialization, making sure that you get that patent in place, because you need to file it most times before you're commercializing. And so that's oftentimes the spot where you need the resources the most. And then as the company grows and scales, managing that freedom to operate risk that's out there, and using IP intelligence, IP landscaping to understand who are the players in that market, who are you going to necessarily be bumping into, and then build a position starting today that you're going to need in 5-10 years from now.
So in your opinion, then, this Elevate IP program is going to help address some of these longstanding issues that you've identified with. And just one thing, I was interested, actually kind of alarmed in your opening statement that universities are actually involved in helping to sell the IP that's being developed on their campuses to foreigners. Do you know, why is this happening? Why would they do that?
Yeah, because there's no incentive otherwise. They're happy to work with these global companies. It's really a photo op. Universities in Canada are mandated with two things: public or basic research and education. In countries like Finland, economic development is one of those priorities. And if that was a priority and a mandated priority with checks and balances for Canadian universities, then we'd be able to see economic development. But right now, Canadian universities, they've oversold. They're not doing innovation. It's Canadian companies that do innovation, and we should be supporting them, and the Canadian universities should be supporting the Canadian companies, and not us trying to find sort of ways to get higher performing out of Canadian universities.
Right, and I think a lot of the MyTax programs and the colleges do more applied research where they actually partner up with existing companies to help solve actual problems. It's not theoretical research. It's to solve a problem that they're facing. So I think that's kind of a more direct approach sometimes than the theoretical research that we get.
Canadian colleges are chomping at the bit for
Yes,
more resources
they are.
On intellectual property. They've been neglected, and they need more resourcing and supporting. IP Ontario, relatively new, starting to fill some of that gap. But it's significantly subscale. Like even Elevate IP, we talk about $90 million, 4 years, spread across the country, and then 2 days later you're down the street, Nokia giving $40 million. And so these are a bunch of small companies that can get picked off very easily, and then major companies getting significantly more resources to be able to continue to accelerate away. So it's the scale, and we need to bring that scale up. And a startup strategy is okay, but we need a scale-up strategy. And startup companies are going to come, they're going to fail, they're going to grow. The ideas aren't that great. But once you're in market and you already know where the next dollar is going to come from, we want to be putting more resources behind those, because the most valuable form of IP, I always say this, is knowing what people are willing to pay for, and then continuing to go down that line.
Right, and I think Elevate IP is for the ramping up. A startup, like you say, is not the problem. It's like growing to the next before you're profitable.
I
and that's where it's
apologize.
making
We're
money.
a minute 30 over
Thank you.
our 4-minute allotment. I'd like to thank the witnesses for being here in person and online. We will now suspend for 1 minute before we enter the in-camera business section of our meeting. So for 2 minutes, we'll suspend and then we'll be right back. So don't go too far.